Well, welcome back, everybody, to the Information Transformation Podcast, where we talk about everything from records and information management strategy to the latest Microsoft innovations to industry case studies and everything around how to digitally transform your organization to not just survive, but to thrive in the modern workplace. So before we get stuck into today's topic about integrating SharePoint with Content Manager, just a little bit of housekeeping. So if you listen to the first episode of the podcast, which we released last year, it was on how to automate your business using Office 365, you would have noticed that I introduced the podcast with a slightly different name. I introduced us as the Information Innovation Podcast. And turns out, what are the chances that there was another business in the same industry that had a podcast with the same name? So we are now the Information Transformation Podcast, in case there was any confusion on that. And the other little bit of housekeeping is we had a great response to our first episode, and some of you guys emailed me asking if we could be made available to listen to on Apple Podcasts. And so we've catered to that, and now we are available, if you didn't already know, to be listened to on any of the major podcast listening apps. So you can listen to us on Apple Podcasts, on Google Podcasts if you're an Android person, on Spotify, Stitcher, YouTube, all the major podcast listening apps. So with that all out of the way, let's get stuck into today's topic, which is about integrating Content Manager with SharePoint. So we found from working with a number of different government agencies and private sector businesses as well that the number one challenge that records and information management professionals face is a lack of end user engagement. So it's all well and good having a great configured records management system with all your retention and disposal schedules in place, but if content isn't being captured by that records management system, if you're not having end user engagement, a lot of that effort can be for nothing. And the reality that a lot of records managers don't want to acknowledge is that end users, non-records people, your everyday staff, don't want to use a traditional records management system. They want to use the everyday tools of the trade that they are familiar with. And for a lot of people, that is the Office 365 suite and SharePoint. So how do you allow your end users to use SharePoint and benefit from the more collaborative functionality of SharePoint while still having your content managed in the background by Content Manager? Well, to answer that question, I've brought on our guest for this morning, Kylie Lack. She is one of our consultants here at McTish and our resident Content Manager expert. Kylie, how you doing? How you feel being on the podcast?
Good morning. I'm glad to be here.
That's good.
Thanks
to
for
hear.
having me.
No problem. Second day back from holidays. I don't think we'll be releasing this until next year, but just getting back in the swing of things. So first of all, Kylie, talk to us a little bit about what your background is with Content Manager and Trim. I know you've had experience in integrating Content Manager with SharePoint for a number of different government agencies. I know you've worked with Trim for a while. So talk to us a little bit about your background with Content Manager.
Well, basically, I started back in late 90s, working for a government agency.
Yeah.
And I started working with a product called Hummingbird back then.
Right.
And that's where I got all my records management experience.
Yep.
Prior to that, I was actually in a records section.
Okay.
So I've sort of done full circle, going from physical records through to electronic.
Wow.
And after the government agency, I did join an IT company which was using Hummingbird. And while I was there, I actually transitioned over to Trim.
Okay.
And that's when it was back in version 6.
Version 6, yeah.
And I started working on the technical aspects of it, the installation and all that sort of cool stuff. And then it wasn't long before I sort of got involved in the front end of Trim. And from there, I think I'm one of the rare species. I do front end and back end now with Trim, Records Manager, Content Manager. And in regards to the SharePoint integration, that actually came in around version 7.
And a lot of people don't know that.
No. So it was late version 7, it sort of came in. And there was a lot of challenges with it when it was first implemented, as anything new there is. And over the years, it's been, I've done quite a few integrations with the Content Manager SharePoint integration now. But I've worked in over 50 plus companies, I think, or with 50 plus companies to actually implement Trim, Records Manager, Content Manager, doing anything from, hey, let's put it in, to can you help me administer it, train it, all of it.
Yep. Awesome. So the full journey.
Absolute full journey.
Yeah. So I mean, you answered my next question. So a lot of people don't know how long the SharePoint integration has been around. So did you say version 7, was it?
Came in late version 7.
Version 7.
Yeah. So, and it was originally designed for SharePoint on-premise because that's what we had back then.
Yep.
But now that we've gone to SharePoint Online, there have been a lot of changes and updates to it. So the integration now actually works with on-premise and the Office 365 SharePoint Online, which is actually pretty cool.
So how has the progression of that integration, I mean, you just described it a little bit, changed, but where is it? So obviously, now it works with SharePoint Online, it works with SharePoint on-premise, but where is it now versus where it was on Trim 7?
Much better. Back in the early days, there were a lot of issues with it.
Yeah, a lot of bugs.
A lot of bugs with it that as new versions of Content Manager got released, they managed to fix the bugs we had beforehand, but more seemed to come out as we went through. The integration with the latest versions, 9.3, 9.4, seem to be very nice at the moment. Haven't come across any issues with them at the moment, but yeah, it's pretty good now compared to what it was.
Yeah, and a lot of people, I think some people don't even know that the SharePoint integration comes out of the box with Content Manager because there are so many third-party plugins that different companies sell. So obviously it all comes down to the needs of the organization. Every organization has different needs, but does the out-of-the-box SharePoint integration, would you say that for the majority of agencies that you've worked with, that comes with enough capabilities without having to go and rely on any third-party add-ons and plugins?
Absolutely. If you understand what it does, it'll do everything you need straight out of the box without having to add in any more complexity with the any third-party integrations.
Yeah. Awesome. So, we get a fair amount of people that message us, saying that they're interested in, looking at different options with integrating Content Manager and SharePoint. So for anyone thinking of undergoing that integration, what are the key considerations and steps you would say that they need to take to make that integration successful?
Well, the first place to start is with your SharePoint information architecture. If you haven't got the design of SharePoint right and understand how it's going to be used within the organization, you're going to have a lot of difficulty trying to put Content Manager integrated with it. Most of the IT departments, they do like to implement SharePoint. They have an idea around their sites, but consideration does need to be given the content types, their document libraries, what metadata is required, and what information should be captured and where should it be captured. It all needs to be understood before you can actually put the two together. Otherwise, you are going to need to end up with a big mess. Need to make sure your governance is sorted. Otherwise, it's not going to be pretty.
Because they are two very different systems. I mean, Content Manager is a very rigid system. SharePoint's very flexible. So there is I guess what you're saying, a restructuring of how you approach your information management that a lot of organizations would probably have to undergo prior to that integration.
That's right. You're trying to mix oil and water. And it is very difficult. So the main change we usually try and help implement is you've got to get your information management, your records team involved very early on. Also, they need to understand and watch the Microsoft Message Center so they can understand what changes are coming up with the Office 365 platform, in particular to SharePoint. And that will help them understand how the organization is going to change to meet these new and shiny things that are appearing or anything that Microsoft's decided to take out. And with that ever-changing world, you've got to be on top of the changes because Content Manager doesn't change too often.
No.
He's pretty rigid, but you've got to try and keep on top of those SharePoint changes.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. I mean, the Office 365 world evolves so rapidly. I mean, even in our organization, that's something that, is challenging, is just always being on top of all the new, innovations and changes that they make. And another way to do that would be to subscribe to the podcast. So
that's exactly right.
Exactly, and then you can hear it from us. So, the National Archives of Australia and Queensland State Archives recently changed their regulations in a way that gives a lot more flexibility to organizations in terms of their retention and disposal schedules. So How does this change the way that people should think about approaching a integration between Content Manager and SharePoint?
Organisations, they're managing a lot more content nowadays, and of course we welcome the changes from National Archives, Queensland State Archives, VERS, the Victorian Electronic Record Strategy, or any of the other jurisdictions as they're making their changes to their information. It used to be that all documents had to be captured, which meant regardless of what you're doing, all your stuff had to go into Content Manager if that's what you were using. But with the introduction of SharePoint into the mix, users are preferring to use this as it's a lot more flexible to use, which we're all familiar with. With the changes with National Archives and particularly Queensland State Archives, the organisation can determine what information is important to them and only save that information into Content Manager. And that allows the non-important information or the documents to remain in SharePoint if that's the case. Using some other tools such as the Security and Compliance Centre with SharePoint to manage the less important stuff allows a bit more flexibility with your records management in the organisation. And records managers are happy that they are capturing all the stuff that needs to be captured while still capturing the less important stuff, but it's not going into Content Manager because the organisation has determined it's not required. So for example, anything that needs to be kept for over 15 years might decide that it's got to go into Content Manager. Under 15 years for keeping can stay in the SharePoint with the Security and Compliance Centre, but that is different for every organisation. It is up to the organisation on what they determine is lower value and significant or high value as well.
And that's an approach, like those changes, I feel like a lot of people in the records management industry still haven't necessarily come to terms with that. They're still very rigid in their, it needs to be done this particular certain way when, the reality is that's not the case. And you can take that approach of sort of what you're talking about, I guess, high value information in your traditional EDRMS.
That's right.
But, Security and Compliance Centre does have the capabilities, depending on the organization, of course, and your requirements, and is continuing to add new capabilities that makes, managing that low value information realistic for a lot of organizations.
That's right. And with those three assets, SharePoint, Security, Compliance, and Content Manager, you are managing everything.
Exactly.
And I know for the records manager, it is really hard to get your head around, no, you don't have to keep everything. But they're still in the mindset, no, we've got to keep everything. So it does get there eventually.
And that's what I was talking about at the start too. It's like, it's all well and good having a really advanced system, but in most organizations, I would say at minimum, a large percentage of information is not being captured.
That's correct.
Because they just don't have the end user engagement.
That's right. They know Content Manager is there, but they think it's too hard. And with the implementation of SharePoint, it is really, really easy to use. And if you integrate Content Manager into it behind the scenes and give the users the flexibility, you'll find that you're going to be capturing a lot more stuff and the user has no idea that it's actually being done.
Exactly. And as a non-records user, as a non-records management person, I can definitively state that you cannot pay me enough to try and work with Content Manager. It's not going to happen,
It's fair enough.
Exactly. So when it comes to, and we've touched on this, how end users operate, every organization is different. So in terms of how end users, how staff work, what sort of situations would suit utilizing this integration? Because it's, I guess, not going to be for every organization.
No, that's right. And you've got to work out, is Content Manager heavily used? If it's been in the organisation for the last 15 years, then it's probably been heavily utilised. There's millions upon millions of records in it. And there's a chance it's going to cost too much to take out. So if that's the case, it could be the implementation of SharePoint comes along. Hey, everyone's going to use SharePoint now. But the records manager's going, hey, we've got to capture our stuff over here. That would be a good opportunity to integrate the two together. Allow the users that little bit more flexibility so they can use SharePoint either in the office, on the mobile device, wherever they happen to be around the world, and SharePoint online. And with the implementation of the Content Manager behind the scenes, you're going to start capturing everything. So for the end user, they're just using SharePoint.
Yeah.
They have no idea what's going on behind the scenes. They may have been told that the integration's sitting there. You may still be using, for example, the record number out of Content Manager, which can be displayed inside your document libraries.
Yeah.
Which makes things a lot easier. So the user just needs to pop their document into SharePoint, capture any metadata that's important to them, and this all forms part of the implementation process of the integration.
Yep.
And then the user's quite happy to do that because the information they're capturing, or the metadata, that's what they need to search on or anything like that.
Yep.
And makes it a lot easier for those documents also to be captured via the integration into Content Manager,
Yep.
which would happen automatically.
Yep. Awesome. So yeah, it's not just capturing the information, it's making it as well more searchable.
That's it. And to make sure that your records managers and the team is involved very early on.
Yep.
Makes it a lot easier. They need to ensure the right information is being captured. And as we said, SharePoint gives users the flexibility to work wherever they are without having to add the complexity of Content Manager on top of it.
Yeah. Yeah, awesome. So, when we talk about, using SharePoint and sort of, having Content Manager manage the information in the background, that's that concept which has been around a while. It's a buzzword that's been in the industry for a while, of transparent records management. Now, realistically, with most organizations, with that integration, how much, if at all, does the end user have to interact with Content Manager, or do they not have to?
They don't have to interact at all.
Yeah.
They just got to use SharePoint.
Yep.
They pop their document into their document library, and the integration is configured as such that it just all happens automatically. Part of the process of putting it all together is, when does Content Manager capture it? 15 minutes after it's been put in, 4 hours, 3 days, 6 weeks. And then down the track, you decide, well, that document hasn't been modified for the last 6 months. What do we want to do with it? And then you can go, well, we can actually take it out of SharePoint and leave it solely in Content Manager. So it is still available to the end user.
Yep.
And that's where also the SharePoint search or the enterprise search comes into play, because you can put the search capability of Content Manager in there. So when you're doing a SharePoint search, you're getting your SharePoint results as well as Content Manager results.
Yeah.
So it's like a one-stop shop for your searching for an end user, which is actually really cool.
Yeah.
So the user doesn't have to interact with Content Manager. They're still getting their stuff into SharePoint. And if there is any documents in Content Manager that the user goes, I need to use that in SharePoint, we can expose it back from Content Manager into a SharePoint document library, and they can use it like it's a SharePoint document.
Yeah.
They're none the wiser.
Yeah. And that that enterprise search is really useful. I mean, I use that all the time, when your metadata is set up correctly. And it's one of those things, like, even for me, that adjustment of realizing you don't have to click through a myriad of different folders to try and find and remember, which folder did I save this in, is just such a massive time saver.
Oh, it's great. I love it. One-stop shop for searching.
Exactly. So what would you say, Kylie, are the three, if you could leave us with 3 key takeaways you would give to anybody listening to this, what would it be?
I would suggest, number 1, have a good information architecture for your SharePoint environment, as well as good governance around it, which not only includes your sites, your teams, your OneDrive, etc., but also includes your document libraries, your content types, your metadata, including your term stores, your managed metadata term stores. And this will help a lot when it comes to configuring the integration with Content Manager.
Yeah.
Number 2, I would always keep the end user in mind. The integration can be used to capture what is required by legislation and compliance standards without affecting the end user. And you don't have to allow records management compliance to dominate how you configure the environment. You just need to know what is best for the organization.
Exactly.
And last but never least, if you don't have anyone within the organization that has a SharePoint Office 365 expertise and records management expertise, we do highly recommend you do work with someone who has this from both sides, not one or the other, because they need to translate how the records management requirements fit into your SharePoint Office 365 configuration. Makes things a lot easier.
Yeah, awesome. Thank you very much for that. Well, I think that covers everything I want to talk to you about today.
Awesome.
So thank you very much, Kylie, for your insights. It's been very useful for me, and I'm sure all of our listeners have gotten a lot out of it. So I appreciate you taking the time to come on the show today and give us some of your expertise.
You're welcome. Thanks for having me.
That's quite all right. And so for anyone listening, if you do want to know more about that integration, we go to our website. We have some free information on our website. And if you have any specific questions, feel free to either email us, fill out our contact form, and I'm sure I will forward those questions on to Kylie, and I'm sure she'll be happy enough to answer them for you. And make sure, of course, most importantly, make sure you subscribe to the podcast. So on whatever app you want to listen to it, remember it's available Spotify. I know, Kylie, you're an Android person, aren't you?
That's correct, yeah.
Yep. So you're probably more of a Google podcast. That's the one I use. Yep.
Yeah.
But again, Apple Podcast, Stitcher, whatever your preferred listening app is, and you can find all the links to those different apps on our website at mctish.com.au/podcast. And at the top of that page, you will also see a little subscribe button. Click that button. Fill out the subscribe form to make sure that you don't miss a notification for any time we release an episode. We have some great content that'll be coming up in the new year. So thank you again to everyone for listening, and hopefully I will see you all in a couple of weeks.
See ya.